So what's been the recent history and trajectory of the convergence movement? Well, the 1980s, 1990s from the Asian crisis, many international bodies and regulators started to argue that actually what was needed was for Asian economies to take US, UK style finance-based models that would enable them to deal with what happened. Because what obviously happened, there was a currency crisis brought about by the collapse in some of the stock markets. People couldn't borrow money, people couldn't get hold of cash, companies started to panic, and the value of the currencies fell. And the IMF moved in and tried to impose Western. The G7, the OECD, WA2, all of these came together, and the idea was they decided to say that what the solution was that those countries that were either coming through the financial crisis in Asia or in Africa were trying to become part of the world economy. The accession countries, which are those Eastern European countries that were trying to join WTO, trying to join the EU. We're talking about people like Greece, some of the Southern European countries that were coming out of recent dictatorships. And at the same time, we then had early 90s with the countries that were coming away from communist dictatorship, and they themselves were also told that what you must do is you must adopt a US UK style free market finance model because that is the one that's proved most successful. And for a while, this seemed to be the way it's going, and this is what people talked about. But then, of course, what happened was the Asian economies around the late 1990s started to stabilize, and in the early 2000s, we had Enron. And Enron was the first of a series of major individual corporate collapses. We're not talking about 2008 financial crisis. We're talking about individual companies that, without being damaged, without being part of a major financial crisis, collapsed. Enron, and we talk about a few others here. You've already talked about one or two others. So we'll look at these, and if you go into the VLE, there are a few other information available. Individual companies badly run. The model that being proposed, the Anglo-Saxon model that was supposed to be so successful, was failing, the US UK model. And so there's a more ambiguous attitude comes along saying, well, actually maybe we shouldn't be giving up the independent ways of working. But people still wanted, there was still a great pressure for a single converged system. The idea that this would make it much easier for banks to work. Alongside globalization, it would make it easier for financial deals to take place. There was also another pressure which is important to recognize, that although no one model seems to avoid all the problems, if you could have your model be the one that came international, there was vast sums of money to be made, plus vast advantages to be taken. Put simply, if there are two companies on different sides of the world at the same size, say company A in the USA and company B in Japan, if the USA model is adopted, they will have an advantage because they're already ready for that. The Japanese company will have to make vast changes to the systems, the way it works, in order to prepare itself for the new globalized, new converged global financial system. That's one of the areas of report that you must recognise. That equally the other way around. If your system wins out, and it's the Japanese system wins out, the US would have to spend a fortune adapting to it. If a new model was to be proposed, a new model that took the best of various other ones, then it'd be more balanced as to which areas would be most expensive. But somebody somewhere, some consultants would have a fortune to be made adapting all the different countries to models. So this is one of the interesting things that we look at. So the recognition that no one model seems to avoid the problems is it leaves us on to the modern day. So what we're going to see, comes 2008, just for reasoning, where is convergence going at the moment? Well, up to the 60s, most of the literature predicted a convergence of the US model, as it argued that US dominance is a continuation of the UK's economic dominance of the previous period, and that both follow the same model of corporate governance. Therefore, this must be greatly successful. So, up to the 60s, the USA model. But around the 60s, 70s, we start the emergence of a new idea, and this new idea is the idea of the hybrid model. And this was related to the idea of the 60s and 70s in Japan. The rise of Japan and Germany in the 60s and 70s led to it was now the case that there would be a hybrid model that rise to dominance. Some model that took the best of the US and UK model, took the best of the Japanese model, took the best of the Germany model, and this would create a new hybrid model. So it's interesting to ask yourself, if this is true, which model has been emerging in countries that have been developing? What model has been emerging in Africa? What model has been emerging in Eastern Europe? These are new countries. These do not have sunk costs. They're not stuck in old models. So You would expect them to take the best system on offer and to develop their own hybrid system that would be good for that. So that's an interesting question. Can we see any model emerging in things? And the answer is no. There does not seem to be a single hybrid model emerging, despite the fact you'd think that the where you'd look for it would be countries that are developing. So Eastern Europe, Russia, Africa. What is emerging there? And actually, there does not seem to be any one particular model doing. So recently, after the 70s, more recent pro-convergent documentations has been unclear which model it thinks it will dominate. A brief period of US-centric domination of the literature in the post-Enron period has given way to a more nuanced argument with regards to relative robustness of the system, while US-UK model has struggled. But then, so are Latin economies. Greek, Portuguese, and Spanish models are to a greater or less extent in serious trouble. So I think that maybe there should be a move back towards the Far Eastern model, but the Far Eastern model still struggles with Japan's lost decade. There was for 10 years and more after 1991, after the asset bubble and the Asian crisis, Japan did not see any growth whatsoever. Asset prices in early 2000s had not increased over what they were at the bottom of the bubble market, of the bubble bursting. So this makes it interesting. There doesn't seem to be any convergence happening. But of course, the argument about convergence is two things. There's an argument over if is it actually happening, but there's another argument saying that perhaps we should want it to happen. We should push for convergence. That. And so therefore we have the arguments for. What arguments for convergence? Cross-border investing. The idea here is that firms compete for international investors. A seasoned investor will look for a common model which will push out the divergent governance and bring in convergent forms. This was the idea that actually for a while, the idea was that people were actually competing for international investors. So companies wanted international investors, therefore it was important to have the books. However, it's also been brought out quite clearly that some companies are capable of having two sets of books, not in a criminal sense, but have a set of books that set the profits up as they would be, say, for instance, in their home country, and a set of books that say the profits up for those people who perhaps are buying shares in them via overseas investments. So, for instance, some Japanese companies have a listing on the US stock market, but for a small percentage of their shares, and they publish sets of books that rebrand their profits and rebrand their costs in a manner that is understandable to the US system. So there's also an argument that the multi-divisional structure, of course, has been argued for a long time, was driving out the Europe and Asian models, and we did see a lot of the family business of the chaebol in the Far East. We saw things like Siemens in Germany starting to adopt this multifunctional approach, the M form, as pushed forward by Chandler. But we see the move with the differences of organisational leadership. Different people would actually come forward, and it actually depended on whether or not they were trying to win which are at the moment. Some companies would try and argue that they were more locally based and they would want to keep local things. They didn't actually want to give in to pressures to change to global international ones. But others would say that actually no, a good organisational leadership must be international outlooking, profit structural outlooking, expansion must be international. Okay? So therefore this was very important to get on with it. So these became key issues. As organisations divided from functional divisions from the M form though to become strategic business units, it became necessary to have an international system of finance reporting so you could look at which business units were actually contributing heavily to profits. Under a non-converged system, it could be difficult to say whether or not in particular parts of the business were more profitable or less profitable. At this stage, many Japanese firms started to partially list abroad, as has been noticed. This reduced the diversity and increased their risk profile within them. But what they're also saying is at this point, US management incentives model, the idea of that being developed in response to agency theory, many firms competing in global markets for products and for investment started to use the same system. But of course, many people would argue that what we had here was rather than a good argument for convergence, we had an argument that showed that US managers were the wealthiest in the world, they were the best paid in the world, therefore other countries wanted a piece of that. So they wanted to actually introduce the system over there. And therefore, we saw the growth of the stock option, which have now become common in Europe and have been banned and are banned in India and China and elsewhere. But many bans are now being lifted, and the stock option model is becoming more and more available at a time when it is starting to have some criticisms of it over here in the UK and the US. The arguments against. Well, the arguments against are based on various different functions. On one side, there's the legal case, and that is simply put forward, has been argued already, that systems are developed in each country that are most suitable for that legal system, and that the governance systems that we use are intertwined with things, laws on tax, what tax you pay, what profits you declare, laws on banking, how much money can you borrow, what security you need to buy, labour laws, labour regulations, etc., and competition laws. America can be very strict on anti-monopoly legal systems. Other countries allow much more intertwined governments, companies to build up with much more higher percentage of market shares, for instance, Japan. It's often said the freer the market, the more likely you are to get a monopoly. So places like Hong Kong, which have very, very free markets, actually are often owned by, most of the businesses are owned by only 4 or 5 different families. So the free market increases monopoly, and those systems would not want a system that would allow them to be undermined by having to obey Western laws. There's also the institution case. In this institution case, we'll talk about different models of different advantages. In Germany, the education, the labour cooperation, the technical, as they say, for high quality small scale engineering, for tools, luxury automobiles, specialty chemicals. That is the German way, and it fits better to have governance systems that manage this small scale engineering, that manage their links and build these links up. The French, however, have a light engineering. They're old elite écoles, the big universities that have been run for many, many years. They excel there in big engineering, rail and nuclear power being their most recent successes. The Japanese specialise in integration, so they need a different governance force, a more network governance that allows all the different companies, the technology, and the banks for the mass assembled goods. But they need a specialist form of governance that relates to the fact that lots of different companies are supplying and are involved in this production. The USA has a more individualistic entrepreneurship approach, which is good for software, biotech, startups, this sort of thing. And again, they need something which simply provides the finance and allows the people to run. So sometimes they say the problem, actually, the case against convergence, is that you converge requires stripping out some of your existing advantages. And then you try and take somebody else on at their own game. So what is the point? They're actually disadvantaging yourself. And this, of course, brings us around the idea that there are newly industrial nations that are developing new models. Surely they would expect, if there was one model that was clearly better than others, you would expect these hybrid models to be based around that. And they simply aren't. There simply is no evidence for the development of a single hybrid model that reflects one way of doing it. And finally, there's a whole series of political battles, one of which we're seeing here in Europe developing over the next year, which is the EU referendum. The reality is people confuse convergence with globalization. They see convergence as being a way of allowing globalization. So there's a big backlash. Globalization has caused a backlash, and although there are differences, that political elites with a battle over globalization, with battles over Europe, etc., they have no stomach for a battle over convergence. They have no desire to take it on. And even in a situation when Europe and Japan were most reliant on the US, when they most required Marshall aid in order to rebuild them immediately after the Second World War, they still insisted on that their model was successfully resisted. The US tried to impose their model on the Western Europe and on Japan, and even these defeated countries with very little, say, successfully resisted the imposition. In fact, German chemicals are brought back from 2 world wars, which must suggest that it's extremely important, the model and the approach they use. And nowadays, even US managers have started to reject some of the shareholder value concepts and have started to operate using poison pills and adaptive actions, which is something that you should look up and we will talk about later. You should also be prepared in the exams and also take a look at the glossary online where some of these things will be defined. If there's anything that you need defining that isn't in the glossary, please let me know.